Right. Welcome everybody to the FAR committee meeting tonight. I'd like to welcome members, officers and members of the public to this Finance and Audit and Risk Committee. I don't think we have any members of the public, unfortunately. Please note that the meeting is being live streamed on the Council's YouTube video. Before the meeting starts, I'd like to invite the committee member and scrutiny officer to confirm that the officers joining remotely can hear and be heard, and to explain how proceedings will work. Abby.
Thank you, Chair. Before we start, can I just confirm that officers attending remotely can hear and be heard? Chris Wood?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Nick Jennings?
Good evening, Chair.
And Debbie Hanson?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Chair.
In accordance with Council policy, this meeting is being audio recorded and filmed. The recordings will be available to listen to on mod.gov and YouTube. If a member wishes to speak, they should use the speak button located on your microphone unit. Please wait for the Chair's invitation before you begin. When requested to vote, voting will be via the yes, no, abstain buttons on your microphone unit. Details of how members voted will be shown on the screens around the room, and the result will be visible on the YouTube stream. In the event of a tied vote, the Chair will have the casting vote. Are there any questions before we start the meeting? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Abby. Apologies for absence. I've received apologies for absence from Councillor Morgan, Derbyshire, and also they're being substituted by Councillor Simon Bloxham. Oh, yeah, okay. Is there any other absences or things we should know about? Nope. Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to item 2 then, with the minutes from the last meeting we held. I'd like to propose that we take this as read and approved as a true record of the minutes of the meeting of the committee held on the 15th of June. Is there any comments, first of all? Is everybody happy with that? And then secondly, can I have a seconder? Seconder, Councillor Weeder, sorry, apologies. Okay, can we vote on that, please, Abby?
Chair, this motion is carried.
Great. Okay, notification, item number 3 then is notifications of other business. There has been no other business notified to me, so that's that one taken care of. 4 is Chairman's announcements. I'd like to welcome those present, especially John Cannon, who's now the independent member for FAR, who's sitting over there. Welcome. Members are reminded to make declarations of interest before an item. The detailed reminder about this and the speaking rights is set out in the Chair's announcements on the agenda. Okay, we'll move swiftly on to item 5, public participation. And yeah, given that there's no public here, you'll be not surprised to hear that there's no public participation this evening. Auditor's annual report. Debbie Hanson, apologies, from Ernst & Young to present. Debbie, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, very happy to present this report. Just a little bit of background about the report. This replaces what would previously have been our auditor's annual audit letter. The new title of this is the Auditor's Annual Report, but in effect it does the same thing. So it pulls together the findings from the results of all of our audit work that's been completed during the year. The key change you'll probably note is that members of the committee, when we presented our original audit results report back in March and then our update in June, we didn't include any commentary on our value for money work in those reports, which were now solely focused on the financial statements audit. Therefore, now the only place you will see detailed reporting of our work on value for money is in this AAR report. So that's really the fundamental difference between this and the previous auditor's annual letter. I won't repeat the messages that we put in the ISA 260, the audit results report, which we presented back in March and June. They are pretty much exactly the same as we previously reported, and members of this committee will therefore be familiar with those. I think the only point I would like to note is that we still haven't been able to issue our certificate on the audit, and that's because although the NAO instructions have now been issued, They are now actually also requiring some additional procedures to be undertaken on a sample of local authorities that are below the threshold, which is the category that North Heights falls into. And until those procedures are confirmed and the bodies that they apply to has been selected by the NAO, we cannot say that we've concluded all of our responsibilities under the Code of Audit Practice. Therefore, we're not able to issue our certificates. That has no significant impact on North Heights, and you're in exactly the same position as every other local authority in the country in relation to the 2021 audits. And obviously, as soon as we are able to do that, we will conclude the audit, issue our assurance statements and issue our certificates. What I would therefore like to do is really just take members of the committee through the VFM section of the report, which starts on page 35. And if I just give me 1 second, trying to move between screens is always a little bit more difficult when we're on the system rather than in person. So you will see that our value for money work covers 3 key areas. So we look at financial sustainability, we look at governance, and we look at the council's arrangements for improving economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And we include detailed commentary in this report on each of those 3 areas. I think the key thing to note is that in all of those areas we concluded that the council's arrangements were adequate, and therefore you had an unmodified audit report with no commentary in relation to any weaknesses on value for money. I just really wanted to pull out a few key areas from each of those sections. So in relation to financial sustainability, we note that the council's got a robust process to identify significant financial pressures, both in the current year and future years. We do also note that the council has identified that you'll need to achieve savings to balance the budget by 2026-2017. And that may mean that the council has to make some difficult decisions. We note, however, that there is an established budget challenge process which will help the council in addressing those challenges. In relation to governance, there's a risk management group that's been well established within the council. There's also an integrated budget setting process, and the council undertakes regular budget monitoring throughout the year. In relation to economy, efficiency and effectiveness, again, the budget challenge process is a key element of that. In addition to that, the council's also got a transformation programme, which will be very important, both in terms of delivering savings, but also improving the 3 E's. The council has performance indicators that it monitors that has been slightly impacted by COVID-19 over the last year or so, but those are still used. And also the council had a peer review back in 2020. An action plan is now being developed to address the issues identified in that. And I think it's also worth noting that the council does work with a number of different partners, and that's part of its strategy, again, in terms of improving economy, efficiency and effectiveness. I wasn't really going to say very much more on the report. I think hopefully it's fairly self-explanatory. As I said, the purpose of it is to wrap up all of our work, both on the financial statements and the value for money arrangements. We haven't identified any significant weaknesses, and members of the committee will already be aware of the reporting that we did around the financial statements. I'm, however, happy to take any questions or comments on the report.
Thanks, Debbie. Councillors and John, have we any questions for Debbie? Yeah, Councillor Home.
Thank you. Yeah, Debbie, no, not a question, really, a comment. I'm pleased to see that the unqualified opinion of the financial statements is there, as in the past, and that as a going concern, that we are doing the right thing here at North Heights Council. So, yes, pleased with the audit report. It's not changed drastically from what we saw before the draft. So, yes, it's good that we are looking after the beans here, and that the auditors are confirming that. And that makes us feel a lot more comfortable in this day and age. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. John Cannon.
Thank you, Chair. I had a couple of observations just as I went through the report. If you can just clarify these things to the extent that you can, please. I think the first one was on page 26 or 27, where the report discusses valuation of land, particularly a valuation of 9,500 per acre as a basis. It's not driving numbers in the accounts, but I wondered, what does that number do elsewhere? Does it have other significance, please? That was the first thing. The second, please, was the pension deficit has risen. How is it being managed? And lastly, just on the improvement plan, the original review was done in 2020. It's a little while ago. How close are we to finalising that improvement plan now, please?
If I can take the first question, which is around the land values.
Okay.
So in undertaking our work on the financial statements, we engaged our own specialist valuer to look at a sample of assets in order to gain assurance that those assets were materially accurately valued. Overall, our valuers concluded that the valuations provided by the council's own valuers were within an acceptable range, and therefore we were happy that the financial statements were not materially misstated. However, we did note that in terms of the land values, as you've noted, the council's valuers used a land value of 9,500 per acre, but our specialists concluded that was actually quite a lot lower than the values we'd expect to see, which would be somewhere in the range of 150,000 to 200,000. We did, however, note that the building valuations we thought were actually overstated due to different assumptions. Therefore, overall, the asset values were within a reasonable range. We did, however, calculate the potential impact of those differences in land values on the financial statements and concluded that the maximum potential impact could be 1.3 million difference on the land values. That, however, would be the maximum impact because of the impact in terms of the building values being overstated. And therefore we were satisfied that there was no material impact. We do, however, recommend that the council does look at the evaluation approach to determine that they are actually using appropriate valuations both for land and buildings. So there is a feed through to the financial statements, but the impact is not material, and it is a judgmental difference as well rather than a factual one. I think in relation to your second two questions, I think they're probably more appropriate directed to the council in terms of the pension deficit. The pension deficit is not unusual. All local authorities will generally have a pensions deficit, but I think probably the council is in a better position to answer those last two elements of your questions rather than ourselves.
Ian.
So in relation to pension deficit, we are required to have a triennial revaluation, which means you have them every 3 years. We've got one in process at the moment. The position as at the 31st of March 2022. In addition to that, we have an annual sort of interim valuation from the actuaries to sort of set what the deficit is. Where we have the 3 yearly revaluation, they set a contribution rate for us, which is made up of a percentage of payroll to cover the sort of accrued benefits of staff in post at the moment. And there's also a lump sum, which is currently around about £1 million, which you pay for essentially the deficit on people who have retired in the past, for which you didn't put enough money aside. And those numbers are set based on a 20-year time horizon to get back to being fully funded. The actuary obviously look at a number of scenarios in working out where that might land, and they're doing that work at the moment. At the moment, it is possible the actual percentage amount we contribute will actually maybe go down slightly based on previous performance. And it's possible that the lump sum will stay the same. But so based on that, there is a plan, albeit a very long-term plan, to get us back to being fully funded the pension scheme. But as you'd expect, there are huge ups and downs between years based on particularly, in the interim to the triennial revaluations based on stock market performance and returns like that. So it can change quite quickly.
Thanks, Ian. John, does that answer your questions and answers the questions for the rest of the members? Oh, remind me of what the third.
The third bit was, please, on the pack page 27, talking about the improvement plan for the council, further to a review that was carried out in 2020. It's a little while ago. Just wonder how close we are to finalising that improvement plan now that it's 2022, please.
Ian, is that yourself or should it be other Ian?
It probably is me. I'm just struggling to find the right reference. I'll make sure I find the right thing.
Okay. I'd like to thank Debbie for her presentation, though. Thank you very much. And I believe that another member of staff is going to be taking over, Rachel, who's on the line today, but we'll see her next time, I think.
No, thank you, Chair. I think I was going to introduce Rachel, but at the point I started, she hadn't, I don't think, been fully let into the meeting. So Rachel is now here. So Rachel Merries is taking over as your audit manager for the current year audits. I work with Rachel on a number of the local authorities, particularly within the Hertfordshire area. And so hopefully you'll be seeing Rachel at future meetings as well.
Well, indeed, thanks, Debbie, and welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Terry.
Hello there.
Apologies about this in the start of this meeting.
That's okay. That's okay. Ian,
Sorry, John,
able
can you
to
just
respond?
clarify the page number? 27 refers to improvement plans, a different page on the improvement plan reference.
My apologies. It's actually page 42, which is substantially different.
I will skip to 42 then and look at there.
I think, Ian, if it helps, it was in response to the peer review that you had in 2020, and the fact that there was a plan being developed in response to that.
Okay, yes. So we had a number of actions coming out of the peer review. I can't remember how many it was now, of quite a few. A number of those were put in place. Some of those were longer term actions, such as things around defining place. And some of them, I guess, have been either slowed down or superseded by the fact that COVID came along and scuppered us somewhat. But I will certainly make sure we go back and have another look at that plan and make sure we've got an update on it, because yes, it has been a long time and probably is worth us, at least as officers and reporting back to the right group, making sure that we have made progress on it and know we're going with it. And if there are actions that aren't going to happen anymore, we know why we're doing that. So if that can be left with me as an action to raise through our leadership team initially.
Thanks, Ian. John does answer your questions now. Yes. Is there any other questions for Debbie or Ian at this point on these subjects? Nope. Okay. In that case, I'd like to. The motion is to note the report. Can we say it's duly noted, or do we need to vote on that? No, we don't, do we? Okay, it's duly noted, unless anybody's got some objections. No, duly noted. And we'll move on to item 7, which is the SAFS annual report with the shared fraud service, anti-fraud, I guess. Should I say not we're into fraud? Can I ask Nick Jennings to present, please?
Good evening, Chair and members. Yes, this is our annual report that we bring to this committee to reflect back on the previous year's activity, where we've been looking at anti-fraud arrangements at the council and working with my service, the shared anti-fraud service. So again, a bit like Debbie, I'm going to skim over things and then make the sweeping assumption that all members will have read the report, and we'll take questions at the end. So as I mentioned, this is a report reflecting back on 21-22. It's based on the delivery of the 21-22 anti-fraud plan that was approved by members of this committee in March 2021, and a copy of that report, a copy of that plan is attached to the report Appendix A. The report looks at the plan and how we structure that plan, put that together in line with current best practice, particularly around the guidance provided by the Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally strategy that was developed in partnership between CIPFA and the LGA and a number of other organisations. That's particularly focused on how local authorities can deal with the risk and the threat of fraud. We then look at SAS performance and KPIs and how we've done against KPIs that we agreed with officers, and the anti-fraud activity for the current year as well. We've also included the transparency code data. So this is data that the authority is required to provide around its anti-fraud arrangements and the outcome from that activity, how much money has been spent on it as well. So that's provided at page 16 of the report itself. If I can just pick up briefly on some of the highlights for 21-22. Mentioned already that we based the plan very closely on the recommendations and the guidance that came out of the Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally strategy, in particular the 5 pillars of protect, govern, acknowledge, prevent and pursue, and the council's policies around anti-fraud and corruption as well very closely reflect the guidance and best practice that particular document recommends for local authorities, including the use of checklists and identifying responsibility for particular activity across the authority by officer. From SAS point of view, page 61, we mentioned that we deployed 1 officer to work for the authority in 21-22, and that officer was also supported by our support team, which includes data analysts, financial investigators, and intelligence officers. And we also have one of our managers, Darren Bowler, also manages that officer on a day-to-day basis. And essentially that officer then is our first point of contact for any officers working with the authority on undertaking any initial investigations that arise. We're going to talk about the anti-fraud activity across the authority, in particular the fact that the council has a place on its website for people to report fraud, links into our website as part of the shared anti-fraud service, again, so people can report fraud to us. That allows us to collate all of that information and report back to you and to senior officers across the authority on the volume type of fraud that we're seeing affecting North Herts Council. The e-learning training that we provide via the council's e-learning platform, that's been updated currently. The new version of that will be released very soon, but the version that officers using at present is still valid. It covers fraud, corruption, bribery and money laundering, and we provide some additional training to officers as well to support that e-learning training as well. Briefly mentioned on page 62, the ongoing impact that we had in 21-22 of the pandemic and actions that we took then to change slightly the way we were delivering our service, in particular around the use of sanctions and financial penalties, and our move really to look at prevention work at the front end, and really the impact on some of the investigations we're conducting where we work with partners such as the Department for Work and Pensions. We also assisted officers, continued to assist officers last year with the grants that were being paid, the business grants, and we provide some additional support around data cleansing and working very closely with National Anti-Fraud Network, CIFAS, and the Cabinet Office to ensure that there was pre and post payment checks against all of the grants that the council paid under the various schemes that the government introduced during the pandemic and in the various lockdowns. We also provided much more frequent and enhanced alerts from a variety of bodies. Actually, go on to mention that in a bit more detail at page 28. Hopefully members can see there that network actually provides the authority with a huge access to organisations and information about new and emerging fraud threats, means that we're on the front foot. So we, if something is seen across either the local government sector or the government sector wider or the public-private banking sector, we're getting a good heads up of those new threats as they start to emerge. We detail from section 29 onwards the number of allegations that have been received by the authority and how those are broken down by service areas, who's reporting those to the authority as well. And then just the caveat really later on about their allegations that we're receiving at that point. Not every allegation is correct. Not every allegation needs to be investigated fully. So we break down in the report how we've dealt with those individual allegations as well. We talk about the outcomes of some of those cases, mentioned some of the investigations throughout the report itself, but at page 34 we've detailed the financial savings and prevention work, the value of that's been identified for the authority. And the work that was then carried forward into this year. So those cases that were outstanding at the end of March 2022. We've given members some detail on the volume of referrals and how that reflects back on previous years. So members will see on table 3 on page 66, there is a table there which just shows them the volume of reported fraud, and it always comes with a caveat that just because something's been alleged, it doesn't mean it's actually a fraud. So we always have to be very careful about that. But it's also, I think, quite interesting to see how that does change year on year. Again, fraud is something which tends to move. It follows trends. We saw a slight upturn in 2020. We thought things were starting to reduce from 2017, 2018. And then on the back of the pandemic and COVID and grants, we saw fraud starting to increase again, or certainly reported fraud increase again, and then start to taper off towards the end of last year. We've broken down in the report the work that we did, or officers did in particular, around the National Fraud Initiative. That those were the matches that we received in 2021. There was a huge flurry of work that the authority receives every 2nd January. And we worked very closely with officers across the authority to make sure those matches were resolved in accordance with the requirements for the council to comply with the National Fraud Initiative. That work, as Ian will tell you, is incredibly resource intensive. And as we've shown at section 39 of the report, the outcome from that, actually, the actual financial value and savings to the authority is tiny. But it is a piece of work that we need to undertake every two years for the authority. And if nothing else, it provides quite good assurance about the quality of the data that the council holds and the fact that there isn't a huge stock of fraud for us to be concerned about at North Hants Council. I just mentioned the KPIs that were set for the Shared Anti-Fraud Service on page 70. All of those KPIs for last year were met or exceeded, with the exception of 4D, which any eagle-eyed members will have seen that we didn't manage to achieve the 10 training events that we promised to achieve in our KPIs for last year. But again, if you read the plan that we put in place for North Hants last year, we shot ourselves in the foot, really, because we actually offered to provide 5 training events, and we did provide that, but we didn't amend our KPIs. So we're probably beating ourselves up over nothing for that. I've just briefly mentioned at page 70 and 71 the work that we're currently undertaking in the current year. So members can see that obviously we are still receiving those allegations of fraud. There is still a significant number of cases under investigation at the present time, but the fraud losses that we're identifying are not huge. They're not significant at present. I did mention the report itself about the work we now do with Settle Housing. This is really important work for the council because council doesn't have its own housing stock. Settle Housing manage the vast majority of the social housing stock across the council's area. Working with Settle Housing allows us to actually undertake fraud investigations on their behalf where there's suspicions of tenancy fraud. The advantage for the authority in us undertaking that work is where we're able to bring those properties back into stock. The council then is able to allocate people from its housing waiting list or housing register to Settle Housing for them to be housed in those properties. So we see that as a real good news story for the authority. That relationship with Settle only started in the 4th quarter of last year, so to be recovering 3 properties so quickly is really, really good. I mentioned already the data, the transparency code data that we provide. The information that is there on page 72, 73. And then just for members' interest, we've included a list of background papers if anybody wanted some light bedtime reading. At that point, Chair, I'm quite happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Nick. Councillor Billing, there's a question.
I just wanted to ask a question about the e-training. It says that it's available for staff, and I just wondered whether it was compulsory or just available, and what percentage of staff have done that training.
The training that we provide, or the module that we provide, sits as part of the I believe it's part of the mandatory training for all officers, but Ian can probably confirm that for me.
Ian?
I will double check that. I think it was mandatory, but I will double check, see if it still is, make sure it still is.
And also wanted to know how many people have taken that.
And I'll have to confirm that.
Yeah. All right, I'm sure. Yeah. Is that okay, Claire? Yeah. Councillor Hone.
Yes. Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, question really is, I see the number of cases we've investigated and various types. How does that compare with our peer authorities? Are we sort of trending the same as they are when it comes to these sorts of incidents, or are we in a better or worse position in terms of a locality?
It's very similar. As you know, Councillor, we've got East Herts Council, Stevenage Borough Council, Broxbourne Borough Council, and Hertsmere are our district and borough authorities that are part of the partnership. The fraud that we're seeing, the types of fraud, is very similar. It's linked to housing, so housing applications. In Stevenage, where they hold their own stock, obviously we work with the housing team directly. Where we're working with our partners, we're working with the social housing providers. It's around benefits. It's around council tax. It's it's that historic type of fraud. During the pandemic, we saw the attacks, those real deliberate attempts, opportunist by probably people living within the borough, and more organised and structured, where we saw organised crime trying to attack those systems that the council was administering. So that we worked really, really closely with officers during the pandemic to make sure that there were measures, there were processes, there were checks in place to really reduce the level of fraud around the grants that were issued. Some got through, quite small numbers compared to other authorities. But again, North Herts, even around the grants activity, North Herts is quite similar to the other authorities that we work with. So yeah, in response, short answer to your question is very comparable in numbers and types of fraud that we see across those authorities.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. Right. Is there any other questions? I've got nothing coming. Oh, yes, I have. Yes, Ian.
Thank you. Not another question from me. I have spoken to Nick around providing some training to you. I remember the last meeting we spoke around the preference being for training in advance of these meetings. So I proposed to Nick that in advance of the next meeting in December, that Nick comes along, say about 7:15 or 6:30, and we offer some training to you on fraud, which allow him to go into a lot more detail, to give you a lot more background and providing these reports. We'll obviously also open that up to other members as well who wish to join us for that session in advance of the meeting. So hoping I'm going to get some nods into a sense to be putting that on. And if so, I will make sure that's arranged with Nick in advance of that meeting.
I think that's great news. Yeah, I'm sure everybody's okay with that. Yes. Yeah, we're all okay. Thank you, Ian. That's brilliant.
Thanks, Ian.
And thank you, Nick. So if there are no further questions, which it doesn't look like there are, then we're going on to the recommendations. Then we want to note that the council's work to combat fraud in 2020, 21, 22. Note the performance of SAF in meeting and its KPIs, apart from obviously, as which pointed out about KPID, about the training. But note it still. Note the progress with delivery of the anti-fraud plan for 2022-23. In that case, can I have a proposer? Yeah, to Councillor Home. A seconder, please. Yeah. Oh, Claire, did you want to say something? Oh, you're seconding. Oh, Claire, we'll take you as a seconder then, right? Okay, and Abby, can you take us to the vote then, please?
Chair, this motion is carried. Oh,
thank you very much. We're moving on to item 8, which is the SIAS annual report 21-22. Chris Wood is to present. Chris, can I ask you to present?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. Never quite know how to introduce this report, actually, so I'm going to be very brief, and either there'll be lots of questions or none at all. So this is the SIAS annual report that looks back at the service and its activities during 21-22 and gives members a chance to receive some information beyond just the North Herts internal audit plan, which is the subject of the next report on the agenda. It's more akin to a company report and that you might see in the corporate sector, and sort of gives a flavour of what we're all about. So I didn't want to specifically draw your attention to anything other than to note that some of its primary readers have been our candidates for recruitment over the years, and they often find this quite a useful tool to learn something about the service when they're looking into whether they want employment with us. But I'll take any questions actually and see where we go with that.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any questions from Councillor Home?
Yeah, sorry, me again. Yeah, I'm interested in the impact of COVID on how you did your audit, because I think it restricted and therefore much of the audit was done in a virtual arrangement. Did you feel it impacted significantly on your ability to audit the council?
I think we got the same level of assurance, Councillor Hone, but it was certainly a different way of going about it. For part of the year, we were able to audit in person, certainly in the second half of 21-22, where it was necessary, but actually I think it's been beneficial overall. We haven't had to travel in as often. We can still interact with the staff who are supporting our audits. We've still been able to have a good level of interaction. We've received a lot of information digitally, which in this day and age, I think, as you know, we don't look at old paper files anymore. So that's been quite easy to share where we've needed it through various secure digital portals. I think the only side that's been more difficult, and we've done it through a lot of screen sharing, has been actually looking at council systems themselves. But that didn't really affect the first half of 21-22, and we're able, where necessary, to do that in person in the second half. So I think overall, actually carrying a lot of what we learned about how we can audit and how we can be more effective, both with our time and officer time, has been so beneficial. We've carried on in 22-23. I think there've been more gains than losses, although still quite keen to form those relationships with staff that perhaps you can't do down a digital channel as I'm talking to you tonight. But I think that's the piece that's missing, is just that personal touch that comes with meeting people in person. But so many officers of the council are working remotely as well that often it's mutually beneficial. I hope that answers your question to some degree.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you.
I think it does. Are there any other questions for Chris on this item? Yes, John Cannon.
Yes, please. Hello. Just picking up a couple of things in the report. I noticed there was an audit coming up of the compliance contract. Just wonder, can you tell me compliance with what, please? Secondly, on the audit plan update, 15% of this year's days have been delivered at the 20th of August. Does that leave you ahead or behind where you'd intended to be, please? And lastly, great to see that there's a cyber audit and an IT audit in planning. I just wondered how they ended up in the medium priority bucket, please.
I'm just wondering, John, if those questions aren't on the next report after this one, and if I attempt to answer some of them when I get to that item, if I might, because that we've got the progress update following the SIAS annual report, which is the one I was introducing. So can I hold those three questions on the compliance audit, the 15% performance, and the cybersecurity till the next item, if possible?
Are you happy with that, John?
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question of Chris? Nothing's popping up on the screen. All right. And Chris, we're still with you because we're going to go to item 9, which is the SIAS progress report for 22-23.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to quickly scroll down to the next item. There we go. And I will pick up John's first question straight away. On page 97, I think, as John, you pointed out, there's a 15% performance or 15% plan days delivered. I should actually point out to those who may have noticed that further down under our performance table, I actually report that as 16%, and it should read 16%. Looking at the performance figures at the end of last week, given this report was produced a couple of weeks ago before I went on leave, it has actually moved onwards to 21%. You'll notice from the audit profile, if you go all the way to the back of my report, there is a, I'm sorry, I've spun so far down, but at the back of the report, there's a table showing the quarters when our audits were due to start. And quite a lot is due to start in Q2 and 3 rather than in Q1. So yes, I do think we're slightly behind. I would like to have perhaps issued draft reports for things like the Careline operations audit. and certainly got a bit further on the compliance contract. So a little bit behind, but as I've been reporting to other audit committees, we have carried a few vacancies through the first part of the year and assigned a number of audits to our external delivery partners who are BDO at the moment, and that takes a little bit of startup time to get moving, but we've got quite good traction on a number of audits. A lot of them are in planning, and quite a lot have start dates in September and October. Just picking up on your question, I guess, straight away, John, on the compliance audit. I confess I probably should know, but in my day job, I am the head of assurance at Hertfordshire County Council, and I'm covering the client audit manager role for North Herts at the moment. And off the top of my head, I cannot think what the scope of that audit was, but I could certainly look it up and communicate it to you unless Ian happens to know off the top of his head. And cybersecurity, if I just find out, it's a reference to it being a medium audit, I think. Cyber risk medium audit, yes it is, due to start in Q3. Cyber risk by its very nature is obviously a high risk to a number of organizations, a constantly evolving theme, new methods of attacking council systems and other corporate systems. So I wouldn't dispute that it's a high risk. We do cover it quite frequently though across all of our partners. And I think there's been an assessment at the moment that it's not a high priority for the council. There are other areas that we assessed as audits being of higher priority. It's not around cyber risk not being a high priority, it's around being a high priority audit for delivery at the council. And in other years, we may elevate cybersecurity and cyber risk into that high category. Nonetheless, it has been identified to be carried out, and all IT audits will be carried out as we've identified at previous audit committees. I think that's covered most of your questions, John, in talking to you so far, except the compliance audit, which if Ian doesn't know off the top of his head, I will get back to you with a scope for that.
Ian's got some comments.
I'm happy to take that. It sits in my area of responsibility, so it's quite an easy one for me. It relates to property compliance. So we have we have existing contract around things like gas safety of our buildings, electrical safety, Legionella, those kind of property checks. Contract at the moment, that contract, we've been given notice to terminate on that contract. So that contract will be in February next year. So it's audits all around the arrangements we're putting in place for that new contract or that new way of doing it from February for next year. So that's what it relates to. That's why we're doing it. And just to sort of slightly clarify what Chris was saying around the IT audits, they don't sort of fit in the same category as some of the others. They're not really a medium priority audit. We do 3 IT audits a year in general, and they have their own category, and we deliver those free audits. So whilst they sort of sit below the medium priority audits on the table, they kind of can sort of sit between medium and high priority. They all get delivered. So in that basis, they'll be more like a high priority in some respects.
Thank you, Ian. Are there any other questions for Chris?
Can I, Chair, just bring a couple of other things to the committee's attention? I know I've been talking a lot. I'll try and make it brief. There's a couple of things I do need to talk to you about.
Okay.
There's an obligation to do so by the various audit standards. So just let me flick across the screen. You'll notice there have been 3 further audit reports, final audit reports issued, which our committee members will have received. There's a health and safety of loan workers, one still at draft report stage, which we're awaiting management responses on. In terms of high priority recommendations, there are only 3 at the moment. We haven't followed them up yet. They have implementation dates in March 23. And if protocol is anything to go by, we'll probably attempt to follow them up at the next committee to ascertain the process. or progress, I should say, even though they're not due until March. I also need to bring audit plan amendments to you, since our committee owns the audit plan on behalf of the authority. So there have been 6 audit plan changes, most of which have involved a reallocation and a reprioritization of days between audits, rather than any new audits in and out of the plan. I've already touched on performance in terms of days and project delivery. So I think I'll probably call it quits there and take any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any further questions? Nothing's coming up. No. Thank you, Chris. Then we need to move on to approve those proposed recommendations. Chris, can I ask you to repeat what those recommendations are again?
Of course, Chair. Just let me get back to the top of my report. So to note the SIAS progress report for the period to 20th of August 2022, and to note the plan amendments to the 22-23 annual internal audit plan.
Thank you. In that case, Abby, can you take us to the vote, please? Oh, yeah, we do need those, don't we? I propose, can we have a seconder, please? Councillor Hone? And Abby, yes, thank you very much for that. And please take us to the vote.
Chair, this motion is carried.
Thank you. That moves us on to item 10 on the agenda, which is the Council Tax Reduction Scheme 23-24. And we're asking Ian Cooper to present, please.
Thank you, Chair. So every year, the Council is required to review its Council Tax Reduction Scheme, and usually that's sort of quite a light touch review. This year, we've done a more fundamental review, which sort of reflects on the fact we haven't done any real change to it since it was introduced. And the proposal in front of you is that it will move to a banded scheme, which means that rather than each person or each property being assessed a rate of discount against their council tax liability, they'll fall into bands, which means that small changes will have less impact and therefore be less administration, less confusion, hopefully, for the residents. This is a decision that will ultimately be taken by full council in January. This report is primarily to notify Cabinet what's going on around the proposed consultation on it, and therefore, because it's got obviously financial implications, being brought to you tonight just for your comment on, in case you want to forward anything to Cabinet next week for them to consider. It only applies to working age claimants. Anyone who is an older claimant, it falls under the sort of mandatory scheme, and therefore we have no ability to change how they're eligible for council tax reduction, but we do have this scheme which we can sort of set the rules on. First thing I'd like to just clarify in relation to the recommendations that are going to Cabinet is that the consultation will actually run from the 14th of September, which is after the Cabinet meeting. It is not started yet because the implied it started 2 days ago. As noted in recommendation 2.1, that consultation will be both with the public and with our major preceptors, that being Herts County Council and the Police and Crime Commissioner, have already provided advance warning to both of them to say that it's coming to those major preceptors, and sort of asked what information they want to allow them to sort of consider that. You will note in when we get to section 10 that the current estimates of the impact of this is that it may cost slightly more. I use the word cost slightly advisedly, in that the actual impact is that it reduces the number of properties on which we can charge council tax on, because those properties which are eligible for council tax reduction count as less than one property in the grand scheme of how council tax works. So if there's a lower council tax base, the more properties you have that are eligible for CTRS. In cost terms, it is quite low, and actually the forecast and view of the revenues team is that actually the cost is likely to come down as we go through various iterations of looking at claimants in the system, and they're doing another look at it this week just to see what the latest position is. And yeah, they expect the numbers to come down from that. I think overall it provides a better experience for residents in terms of they get a more, they stick in one band, they don't keep moving around, particularly with the introduction of universal credit, which can change on a very regular basis. That means you're not constantly getting new council tax bills, which is just sort of ridiculous for both resident and for the admin in our teams in doing this. There are some people against it out of this, and given it costs broad the same amount of money, there will be some losers. And throughout this, we've been looking at who those losers might be, and making sure that seems fair. But at the same time, mentioned in the report, it does sort of talk about there being looking at a discretionary element to this as well, to sort of aid the transition, so that those who might lose out first up wouldn't be too badly impacted to start with, and then we sort of move across to fully implement the scheme over time. I think that's kind of a summary of the report as it stands. Happy to take any questions, and Councillor Abbott's been heavily involved in this as well, so I'm sure he'll be happy to sort of help me out with any questions that are in all the detail, because he's been very involved, because it sort of sits in a slightly different team to me, but although I have been sort of aware of what's going on.
Thanks, Ian. Do we have some questions? Councillor Hone.
Yeah, thank you. How this change and the new way in which we're going to operate, are any other of our peers doing similar things, making a similar change, or are we unique in going down that direction?
I did actually ask the county council that question when I was asking, we're going to be consulting with you on this change, and they said we were the first, so which somewhat surprised me. So I think we are potentially somewhat unique in doing this within Hertfordshire, given that people that I got.
Yeah, I thought that was the case. So hence the question, so everybody knows the answer to it. We'll just have to see how it transpires, particularly for those people who are losing out. They're the ones that will give us members a concern, because we may well be getting the feedback from those residents, those ones who are losing out as a result of this change. I understand why we're doing it. Yes, the system is complicated, but we'll see how we get on the first year, and look forward to report next year of how this did work, and if it was effective and did what we expected it to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I did pick up there was a contingency budget to try and transition and help out anybody who's losing out. Is that for just 1 year, is it?
I don't know, Councillor Albert, do you have these allowance and last one?
Councillor Albert.
Yeah, I mean, initially that is for 1 year, but we're obviously minded to look to see how that might progress further. I think we certainly can. I haven't got the numbers precisely here this evening, but we certainly obviously can let colleagues have kind of the numbers of, if you like, the winners and losers. The number of losers is, we've modelled and remodeled this, and it is now a relatively small number. Certainly, I mean, off the top of my head, I believe it to be less than 100 in total. But we still need that discretionary scheme. And you're absolutely right, Councillor Holmes. Obviously, that's an important part of the process, particularly in this coming 12, 18 months, where people have got so many other challenges, and we wanted to make sure that council tax reduction, as much as possible, wasn't one of those things. And we've got a simple system for people, and that actually is beneficial to a lot of people as well. So I think yeah, but no, entirely take your point, and but I'm happy to kind of pick up separately if you'd like to see this a little bit more detail on the the kind of winners and losers, if you like.
Yes. I was just thinking that would be quite useful for all of us to hear, actually, Ian. If that's we could schedule that in next one. Thank you. Right, are there any other questions? Councillor Billing.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a further question about the discretionary aspect. I wondered if that was something that people would have to apply for, or whether they could phone up and say, I'm having difficulties, and then discretion would be implemented at that stage, or whether it's a long process where they have to fill in reams of forms.
That'd be for Councillor Albert, I think.
So I mean the process here, that I mean the discretionary scheme is obviously specifically aimed for those who might not otherwise be entitled. They will then be able to, and what we will be looking at is that where we've identified that someone is in that situation, we will actually be proactively contact them and talk to them about the discretionary element of the scheme, and no doubt obviously that they because they will have already given us their circumstances, and we'll know what their position is. It's then a matter of just obviously working through with them what their circumstances are, and obviously then deciding on the discretionary element. So no, they won't need to fill in loads of additional forms. They've already completed an application in order to decide where they can be on the scheme, and then obviously we'll then look at how we can deal with the discretionary element once we've decided that they're not entitled.
Does that answer your question? Thanks, Claire. Right, there doesn't seem to be any other questions coming up. In that case, we're going through the recommendations to note the full review is well underway. Note progress made so far on the review. Note intention to review to introduce a new scheme that will enable us to increase overall level of support for lowest income families and reduce administrative burden on the council. And to note the modelling for the new scheme may increase the costs for those on the current scheme, although I did pick up from Ian's statement that it might even reduce. Maybe the recommendation is we would like to know a bit more about the scheme that you were offering earlier, Councillor Albert, for the next session. Okay, in that case, that's all we need to do. There's no vote for this one, so we're just duly noting it. That moves us on to item 11, which is the first quarter investment strategy, capital and treasury review 22-23. And be no surprise that Ian Cooper's going to represent this.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the report that takes us through the investment strategy, which is the combination of our capital programme and our treasury investments. So I'll take you through the report, sort of skimming through the various sections and picking out some of the key highlights. So I start in section 8.2. There's a table there that shows the history of our capital budget since it was first set in February 22, and the various changes that have happened since then, which takes us to a starting budget for this year of 12.252 million. And then working through to the next table, we've already got some schemes whereby it's clear that the spend won't happen in this year. The biggest ones of those being the John Barker Place redevelopment. That is an amount of money that we agreed a number of years back to provide to Settle for that scheme in Hitchin. In talking to Settle, it's clear that we will not get to the right point of the phase of construction to give that grant to them in this year, albeit the building work is going on and it has made some good progress, but the money that we're giving them is linked to the delivery of housing, and actually the delivery of new affordable housing and new social housing in that area, not just the bits that are kind of moving the housing around, which enables that further development. The next two in that table are purely around accounting and aren't real money. So IFRS 16 is an international financial reporting standard. 16, that was supposed to be implemented for local authorities during this year, which would require us to put essentially leased vehicles onto our balance sheet, and therefore they need capital provision to be able to do that. To make it easier for councils in terms of the continuing impacts on the financial statements and the work of auditors in relation to those, that has been delayed yet again. To be honest, it wouldn't have been too much work for us to implement it. We already had all the numbers anyway, but it's been delayed. So we don't do that adjustment this year. So the impact will be felt next year in terms of adding those to our balance sheet. And then we've got a few schemes around the Newark Road, Close Road, which I think is in Royston, and the Lairage car park works, which have been delayed for the reasons set out at the end of that table. So then moving on to table 3, we've got some new capital projects in there, or new spend in relation to them. So we've got the Park Homes insulation spend will be £341,000. That is fully funded from a grant. So adding that to the capital programme, obviously no cost to the authority, and it's work on people who work in park homes to make them better insulated, which obviously helps by way of the council's green agenda, and also helps those people living in the houses to be able to hopefully better be able to afford their energy bills. Next one down is around some Section 106 projects. So as we get Section 106 projects that are eligible, we bring both the project and the funding into the capital programme, and we've so far identified £169,000 of that funding that will be used in the current year. And then we've got some projects where we are looking at some overspends, and in the case of a couple of them, we are looking for cabinet approval to continue with those in line with the financial regulations. So in relation to playground renovations, there was some carry forward from last year in relation to the interactive play, and whilst that has progressed to being finalised, and that was within the overall envelope of the available budget for the playground renovation budget in total, it was more than had been initially budgeted for, and that combined with the planned works for the other redevelopments during the year to count to the playgrounds means that the variance will be more than the allowable tolerance within the financial regulations. So seeking cabinet approval next week to continue with those works and do those playground renovations across the district. Has been identified we've got some Section 106 funding we can use, so the actual impact on the council is less than the £110,000 there. It's netted off by £81,000 of Section 106 funding we can use. And then some more overspends where we're going to be holding on at the moment. So the Royston Leisure Centre solar thermal, we got some quotes back and they were £20,000 more than budget, which is outside tolerance. So that has been put on hold until cabinet decision one way or the other next week, so we'll continue with that. The next two relates to boilers at the two outdoor pools. These are slightly odd in that got the original quotes back and they were within budget, well, they're above budget, but within tolerances as set out in the finance regs. So we went ahead with the works. As the works progressed, they found a few extra things that then took us over the threshold, but made no sense to abort the works at that stage. So the tolerance is outside the finance regs, but for good reason. So we'll seek a sort of retrospective approval from Cabinet next week to sort of confirm we should continue the works. But if we'd stopped the works mid sort of replacing a boiler, it would have made absolutely no sense. We've spent more money stopping and starting again than the amount we're talking about. So just sort of explain that in terms of making sure we're sticking with the financial rules. And I'm sure you'll all be aware the last on the table is the acquisition of Churchgate that was approved by council, and that has finally been completed in terms of the due diligence process, and that purchase, the final price we paid is lower than the budget we had in place. So that's reported in the table at the end there. And then the table 4 sets out the spend on capital and how we're going to fund it. You will note that the forecast of additions to our capital receipts during the year is 5.5 million, and a couple of those already progressed this year already, which is obviously good for funding our capital programme, which means that we continue to fund all of our capital programme from capital reserves, set aside receipts, Section 106 and other grants and contributions, and there continues to be not a need to borrow to fund our capital programme, which obviously helps with our costs. So then moving through the report to section 8.9 and looking at treasury management, capital is a big aspect in terms of how much cash we have, but all the other revenue reserves and revenue provisions we have also contribute to that. And we need to invest that surplus money somewhere to both make sure it stays safe and diversified, but also to generate a return. And the table 8.12 sets out where we're investing it. At the moment, government are giving good returns in terms of looking at sort of fairly short-termish cash deposits. And that's why we've got 45% of our money with government at the moment, which is in theory, the safest place it can be. So that's why that number is quite so high. And then if we move on to the table at the table on page 131, doesn't have a table number, you will see all the various places we've got our money invested at the moment. And you'll be able to quite quickly see the older investments. When I was talking to you last year, we were talking about a good return being 0.1%, how times have changed. And now we're looking at returns that are, the highest one on here, we're looking at almost 1.5%. And as time's moved on since this report, we're now looking at returns above that. So positive, I suppose, if you're looking purely at treasury function, but obviously the reasons for that are really quite negative as to why we're in that position. So I think it's sort of worth highlighting that there are some in there that are obviously old treasury deals. If you look at the sort of second one down, Marsden Beyond Society, that was one that was taken out, I think, a year ago. And that's why it's only paying 0.25%. When that gets sort of brought back in and replaced with a new deal, it will be at a much higher rate. I guess it is worth highlighting that even though these rates are much higher than they are still not keeping track of inflation. So the value of our money is slowly being eroded, unfortunately. So that takes us through the main body of the report. You will note that at Appendix 2, when it's B, which starts on page, scroll down to it. Can't find page number. We've got the sort of detailed report on sort of Treasury and our position on that. And that starts off with some forecasts from our Treasury advisors, who are Link Asset Services, and then proceeds through the various indicators required to report to you, which sort of cover things like the amount of outstanding debt we've got, and we continue just to have our historic debt we took out many, many years ago. We are slowly repaying, but there's still no incentive to repay it early. But what I did want to highlight to you, which I thought was probably quite useful to show you, is on page 149, the graph at the top there. You will notice the maturity structure of our investments is quite short. That is currently quite deliberate. We've got interest rates that are going up, it seems, every time the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England meets. And there, so rather than putting out money for a long period and risking that turns out to be a very unsensible decision in terms of then rates get away with us, and we've invested at a lower rate than we could have got if we'd kept it more liquid. We are keeping those investments short term. Obviously, we'll have to switch away from that as time progresses. When it gets clearer that we're going to reach sort of a peak of interest rates, we will then look at putting out money for a longer period to sort of provide some protection about that reinvestment risk. But I think at the moment, all the reinvestment risk is from going out too long rather than too short. Obviously, lots more detail in the appendix. Happy to take any questions on it, but I think in terms of the introduction to the report, I will stop there and I'll open up to questions.
Do we have any questions for Ian on this subject? No? Oh, yes, we do. John Cannon.
Thank you. Just curious about a couple of numbers in the pack, please. On page 129, I noted that there's 1.3 million of funding that's dependent on other third-party grants for the programme. Just how certain are those grant funding pieces, please?
That will generally be funding from government, and therefore it will be linked to grants we've already sort of aware of and know about, and therefore, I have no issues around that in terms of certainty. So, not something where we've got high risk capital schemes that depend on third party funding until they continue.
Okay, John.
Got one more.
Okay.
One more. Am I on? Thank you. It's not a partisan question. I noticed that Churchgate, you spoke about Churchgate, 4 million spend. That's acquired it. There's no capital spend going forward to do anything with Churchgate. Is that intended? Maybe the council will be spending revenue, not capital, for example.
The plan will be definitely spend capital, but we are working through a plan at the moment. We're kind of in the process of setting up a project board in relation to that, and then that will sort of set out our strategy around the necessary and important public consultation around that site, because as all council aware, it's a very strategic site in Histon, and therefore we need to engage with residents and other parties to work out what we're doing with it. And obviously we've got plans from the various things that have happened in the past and failed schemes around what could go on that site. But until we've got something a bit more certain, we've not got anything in the capital programme, I think realistically we'll be looking at holding it for at least 2 or 3 years, or maybe a little bit more, before there's a sort of space in the ground. Obviously with planning and stuff having to go in there as well to sort of for any developed scheme. So at some point there'll be a capital spend in there against it. But at the moment it's a case of we've got it in our ownership. We can look at sort of making the best of it while we've got it, and sort of making sure that it sort of thrives in its current form. And then, yeah, that project will look at the future in terms of that future spend. But yes, definitely capital spend, and definitely like to be quite significant.
I certainly understand that question, because it's, in my opinion, I think it's the Churchgate is quite a tired facility, isn't it? So would require some investment in the future. Is there any other further questions for Ian on this subject? No. Okay. Well, we'll go through the recommendations then. We're going to note the forecast expenditure of 12.252 million in 22-23. We approve adjustments to your capital budget for 22-23 onwards. We note the position of the availability of capital resources, and we're going to note the position of the Treasury management activity. This report has been presented to us for comment before it goes to Cabinet. Is there any other further questions or comments at this point? If not, I'll be moving on to item 12. No, okay, we'll move on to item 12, which is the first quarter revenue budget monitoring 22-23. And Ian's going to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is another report that's going to Cabinet and comes here, as those who've been on the committee before will know, it's kind of comes here for comment and questions, so we can forward anything onto Cabinet we want to. So I'll take you through the report. So the last one, this is around our revenue budget. So that's the money we spend on the day-to-day stuff, including staffing and our contracts and those kind of things. So if I start off, and I'll jump forward to just a note on 7.3. So when we went to Cabinet in June, we had the end of year position. Following that, and in preparing the statement of accounts in time for the end of July, we did notice one adjustment needs to make to last year. So we put that through on the statement of accounts, and it does affect the closing balance on the general fund at the end of the year. And you'll notice in that line, it explains why that comes about. And also, as I highlighted in that end of year report that went through Cabinet and onto full council, the amount of transfers of to and from earmarked reserves was known not to be quite there yet, because we're still waiting for the final decision on the collection fund accounting. So this just confirms what the final numbers were. I did highlight there'd been change of that order of magnitude as we got to the end of that process. That bit there also notes that the current plan from our external auditors is that it will commence the audit of the 21-22 financial statements in November. Watch this space. I don't know if they'll start then. That's the current plan. As per the experience in previous years, it's a very difficult time for auditors in getting resource and getting around all the audits need to get done. Our draft accounts have been published in line with the requirements, and they are on our website. And we have now gone through the public inspection of accounts period. We've had no feedback directly to us. At some point, I will check with auditors if they have any feedback on that process. But that is the process where it gives the members of the public and residents the chance to ask questions and seek out documents that we hold in relation to those statements of accounts. So moving into section 8 and looking at table 3, there are some big numbers in there. Quite fortuitously, I suppose, a lot of them offset each other, such that the impact is much lower than it could have been. In terms of variances that are sort of moving in the right direction in terms of reducing our spend or with increasing our income. As we alluded to in the last report, the first one there, it does relate to the Treasury investment income, at which we've got a current forecast of an underspend of 589,000. And at the moment, we forecast that being a continuing impact of £500,000 in future years. That's being a bit conservative, I think. I think that number this year will increase, and it might be the number next year can increase. But then looking forward into years beyond that is then it gets a lot more uncertain. So certainly not going to be balancing the budget purely on Treasury investment income, because it does move so much. At some point, hopefully inflation will peak, and then interest rates set by the Bank of England will start to come down again, or will stop rising, wherever they may end up. So what we did do, and those of you around when we set the budget, we did set quite a big provision at the start of the year in relation to the impact of COVID-19 continuing. So in these various lines in this report, you will see a number of our current forecasts, and actually looking through those, that amount we set aside at the moment seems to be about right, near enough. So a lot of the variances we reported in here are allowed a release of that provision we've set aside to sort of balance that off, and that's the kind of second line there. The other big area where kind of budgets are moving in the right direction is in relation to recycled materials, and that's on page 160. So at the moment, the value of recycled materials is very high compared to where we forecast it would be. But just like interest rates and Treasury income, in fact, even worse than that, material prices for recyclers jump around all over the place. And again, in that respect, whilst we're forecasting a budget variance of £341,000 underspend this year, there's nothing in the forecast for next year, because it will move in some direction or other by then. And I would not want to bank a budget based on trying to forecast those. So being prudent, we're keeping that where it is for now. In terms of big areas of overspend, a lot of them are covered by the amount we set aside for the impacts of COVID-19. The one that isn't, and will be a recurring theme through this report and the next one, is in relation to staff costs. So we've put in there the forecast based on the current employer offer to the unions, which is a £1,925 increase for all pay grades. That is being considered by the unions at the moment. They have gone out to their members. Two of the unions have gone out with no recommendation. One of them is recommending the employees don't take up the offer of that from the employers. That is due back sort of in September, October time in terms of when they will hear back from unions. Whichever way, if it goes in favour of that being the agreed pay offer, we will work as quickly as we can to get that money paid into our wages of all our employees, to make the cost of living a bit easier for them. Obviously, if it's not agreed, then we can't do anything, and we have to wait until there is an agreed pay award before we can pay any money to our employees. So, but we'll be ready for, as soon as we can pay it, we'll get it to our employees. Please be assured about that. But yeah, as I said, lots of other lines in the report, but I've sort of picked out a few of the big ones in that bit there. And then moving through the report and going on to, try and scroll a bit quicker for the report. Okay, very slow, the table's so big. And I will jump to the corporate financial health indicators. So for a number of years, we have set a number of areas of income, which are the more significant areas of income to the council. And this is looking at paragraph 8.6 on page 163. For those of you who are around next year, last year, we have changed some of these. We used to have land charge in there, which has actually sort of turned out to be an income source for £100,000. So we put some bigger numbers in there in terms of the more significant areas of income to the council. And again, got the RAG rates we always had in terms of red being when they're going to miss the forecast target, green currently on track or to either match or exceed, and amber looking a bit uncertain as to whether we'll get there or not. So we've got those in there, and those now cover things like garden waste charging, which is obviously significant source of income, planning fees and car parking, some which were there before, but some which are new ones on there. And in table 5, we've also got some activity linked to those, which hopefully has helped and sort of given some context, not just looking at pure money numbers, but looking kind of what sort of supports that. So we've got some number of leisure centre visitors in the quarter, bin subscribers for the garden waste charge, and the other ones in that table as well. So then carrying on with the report, you will note, hopefully, if I highlight to you at paragraph 8.13, we have recently received an email from the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. It went out to all local authorities about interest in business rate pooling. To give a bit of background, business rate pooling, well, business rates in general is quite a complicated system of funding for local governments. We collect business rates on behalf of ourselves and the county council and central governments. Of the amounts that we collect, we get to retain a very small portion of them. And if there's any growth in those business rates, we do get to retain a bit of that growth, but most of it goes back to the other sources, and most of it goes back to central government. Pooling allows the authorities in an area to club together and keep more of those gains. In a business rate pool, you need to have the county council, and then you have a number of districts, usually 4 or 5, to kind of create that pool. And the email came out on the 18th of August saying any interest in business rate pooling for this year, so for next year, but and requiring a response by 22nd of September. It actually gave no guarantee there would be the opportunity to business rate pool. In previous years, it's sort of been very much, do you want to business rate pool? And if you say yes, you get to go ahead with it. This year, it's more uncertain, but we are looking at, as a joint Hertfordshire County Council and all the districts, looking at the modelling. Would a pool make sense for Hertfordshire? And if it would, which districts and boroughs should be in the pool? So the whole point of this paragraph and the recommendation is that we are seeking delegation from Cabinet to myself in consultation with the Executive Member for Finance and IT, Councillor Abbott sitting over there, that we can commit to a pool if it's looking beneficial for us. And that's just purely so we can meet the deadlines that have been set by governments. And we've already commissioned some work as a joint group of chief finance officers across the county to look at would that make sense, and would North Herts be part of the pool? Obviously, if we're not part of the optimum pool, we won't have a choice decision to make. If we are, and it looks beneficial, then we'll take a decision to pool and hopefully get some of those gains that arise from that. And then the last thing I think I'll just highlight to you is in relation to table 7, which gives us our general fund, and that is the kind of the council's core pot of money. And the current projection is that we will be actually slightly ahead of where we were forecast when we set the budget, which is a good place to be given the uncertainty we face. And when it comes to the next report around medium-term financial strategy, having more money in our general fund reserve will be good news in terms of planning for the future. So I think I'll stop there. Obviously, a lot more detail in the report, and happy to answer any questions on it.
Thank you, Ian. Councillor Billing.
It's going back to table 4 again about the income generator things. I wonder why Churchgate wasn't included in that. Is it because it's too early to include that in this budget report? Because there will be some sort of income from the properties there.
Yes, I guess there's none of our estates income in there. So our estates portfolio generates income around £1 million a year. We would expect, based on the report we brought to council, that the income we used to get from Churchgate around about £140,000 from the head lease will go up to reflect that we will be getting income directly from the tenants there. So yes, it's a good point. Maybe we should put sort of our commercial portfolio of income into there in terms of our estates. But yes, I think there is, as well as some extra income from Churchgate, there's also a lot of risk as well, particularly in the sort of the medium term. So you need to look about how we reflect that income that may be in excess of what we had before, and maybe set some of it aside in reserves just to kind of mitigate the impacts that might be coming down the line.
Councillor Hone.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions if I can. On page 162, which table, well, give up what table it is. We mentioned there about expenditure on electricity and gas. We say our supplier is expecting prices to be fixed for the remainder of the year. Are we being optimistic there, saying that we only expect a £25,000 increase on a £300,000 or £290,000 spend? Do you think that's realistic?
I think it's realistic this year. I think when we come on to the medium-term financial strategy report next, there's a further increase on top of that we'll be assuming in terms of that report for next year.
Assuming this time around that should be sufficient. Thank you. And secondly, the next question is on business rate pooling. I understand what you're doing here, as you know. I assume that we've benefited from it in the past few years. It's been positive for us to be a part of a pool, business rate pool, as it has been in the past. In the recent years, has that been the case?
Yes, it has been. Yes, it sort of varies. I think it can vary sort of from pooling gains of between £300,000, I think up 1 year up to about £600,000. So yes, we've definitely benefited in the past from being able to business rate pool.
One is around the AFM. Have we got any indication from County Hall whether that number's good?
We generally account for AFM a year in arrears, so this would be the number from last year, which would have been confirmed by now. I don't know the position this year for this year, which is what we'll account for when we get it next year yet. Albeit I think that in general we're sort of a slow, gradual rate of recovery, but still nowhere near back to where it used to be.
I guess it's recovering as a result of COVID anyway, yeah. So it should really be going back up to, as you said, where we were perhaps 3 years ago. I'm not sure I go all that way, but certainly 3 years ago, it should get a lot nearer. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other questions for Ian on this subject? Okay. Nope. Okay. Well, in that case, we're just going to we'll note this report. Approvals for changes for 2022-23 to general fund budget. Note that changes to 23-24 general budget as well. It delegates to the Service Director Resources Authority to enter into the business rate pooling arrangement if available. So as far as we're concerned, this report was given to us ahead of Cabinet, and we've gone through any questions, any comments so far. So in that case, I've proposed we just note this report and we'll move on to item 13. 13 is the medium-term financial strategy, which Ian's just alluded to, and Ian is to present.
Thank you, Chair. This is another report that is, well, it's going to Cabinet and then Council. So it'll go to Cabinet next week for them to hopefully recommend on to Council. And I will move straight to the Appendix A, which is essentially the thrust of this report. So the purpose of this report is to set out my view on where I think our budget is going to be in future years, and then use that to set a strategy as to how we're going to manage that. And the theme of this is that we have now got the double impact of still recovering from COVID. There's still some costs there that haven't recovered, and there are still some income sources that haven't recovered to where they were pre-COVID. And now we're hit with the double whammy of now dealing with inflation as well at some astronomical levels. So again, not a happy report, I'm afraid. I guess the one positive we've got in this report is that we do start off, and I set this out in page 175, is we do start off with quite a high general fund balance. And as we go through the report, there is some other areas where we've got some other reserves, which I think are safe to release into the general fund. And therefore that does give us some ability to sort of smooth out some of the bumps that are going to come along the way. So starting on page 176, that does sort of cover the COVID-19 impacts, and saying that we're still going to set aside an amount in 23-24, albeit roughly half the amount of the 22-23 amount for continuing impacts of COVID. That's assuming the continued recovery. In some areas, recovery is looking quite strong. Actually, the leisure management contract is recovering quite well. We've got some more recent forecasts from Stevenage Leisure, and that's going very well, albeit that, We've got things like swimming lessons and people attending fitness class and fitness memberships, which may be affected as we move into cost of living impacts and people choosing not to continue with those, and that would obviously affect the income there. I think in relation to parking, a lot of the short stay car parks have recovered and the income is there or thereabouts, certainly quite high, sort of 90% odd level of where it used to be pre-pandemic. But it is the season tickets and the long stay car parks where, I suppose, as you'd expect, people less going into work in the towns, and therefore that's taken the hit in terms of ongoing income. But we'll keep an eye on it and hope it does sort of continue to recover back towards normal. I think all the other ones on there, recycled materials, I sort of spoke about in the last report. We've got a provision in there for future years, but it is highly erratic. We don't know where it's going to go. But I think it's sensible to keep a little bit of provision there because there are still some ongoing impacts. And then as we move on to the next page, it does go for various bits around the impact of inflation. So we've got the cost of providing our contractor services, pay inflation for our staff, policies around fees and charges, eligibility for CTRS, and interest rate increases. So in terms of our contractor services, the big highlight there is the fact that we are looking at a just under 10% increase in the cost of our waste contract moving into this current year, so from May 2022, and forecasting a similar increase for next year as well. The increase this year being driven primarily by fuel inflation, but probably expecting that will sort of transfer across the other areas of that contract in the following year. Before hopefully coming back to sort of more normal levels from May 2024 and sort of settling at around 2%, which is our sort of our general, in the new normal times, our sort of what we're assuming around inflation. Pay inflation, highlighting the support around the offer from employers to the unions, and assuming, at this stage is our best guess around what that'll be as a pay award for this year, and then assuming another 4% increase for 23-24. Again, that could be a fixed rate across all grades, which means that sort of the lower grade staff would benefit more than the higher grade staff, or it could be more evened out. We just don't know yet, but that's a forecast for now. And again, hoping that by 24-25 we get back into more normal times and looking at 2% inflation. The next section around fees and charges is looking at, with inflation as it is, our old policy of CPI plus 2% increase in our fees and charges, I think just doesn't pass muster. So looking at what we should model there. I think in general, a lot of our fees and charges will be linked to staff costs in terms of the cost of providing those services. So if you look at full cost recovery, we probably are looking at increases of more like 2 to sort of 4% in those increases. So I think it's probably fair to at least consider continuing with a cost recovery basis on our fees and charges, and therefore modelling a kind of 4% increase on those in this report. There are obviously some areas we've set out in there where we've previously made decisions around keeping those fees and charges paid to a different rate. So both parking and the garden waste charges are currently paid at 2% increase per year. So the modelling assumes that will continue. We do think, though, the market can bear a 10% increase in line with the increase in our contract costs on trade waste. And therefore, we are proposing in the modelling that is what will happen moving into next year. And that is a reasonable proportion of our inflation, of our fees and of our charges in that respect. And then moving through, we've just talked about CTRSA, about the new scheme coming into place. So that's mentioned again there, but obviously there is always the risk that just the pure number of people eligible for CTRS changes and moving to recession. That is likely to have an increase. Just even whatever scheme you've got, you have more people potentially eligible for CTRS. So that risk is highlighted there. But I think given our sort of fairly prudent 0.5% increase in tax base growth, that's probably manageable. That's the number of new properties built in the district, and given the potential for adopting a local plan in the near future, that might be a realistic forecast. If we don't adopt the plan, it's probable that housing growth will be lower, and therefore we would have an issue in terms of budget. I think in the waste cost section, I also highlight in there's some sort of big stuff coming along around some government changes to the way waste is collected, in terms of what consistency of what bins people, districts are required to put out and have collected, and also things around the deposit return scheme, which mean it's people would take things like glass bottles and cans back to shops potentially rather than put them in their waste bins. So those are some quite big changes, currently uncertain, but the key bit being that we're looking at our waste contract retendering and making sure it's fit for purpose in terms of whatever might come out of government or in that. And we are still waiting for that. But again, a risk there in terms of what the cost will be of that. And whilst there's a new burdens doctrine in place and has been for many years around if government put in place changes that increase costs for local government, they should provide funding for that. That's generally a formula basis or some way that's not just directly into costs. So some will win and some will lose, and therefore highlight the risk there that we could be a loser. We could also be a winner, but we'll have to wait and see. So I don't want to commit to anything on that, but highlight that as a risk. The next section, which starts on page 180, is looking at our various projects in our council delivery plan, which we looked at for the first time as a sort of quarter review at overview and scrutiny last night. And this sort of sets out where those stand in terms of the ones that continue into future years, where we stand resourcing wise on them. There obviously are some risk highlights in there where there is no current resource to deliver them in future years, and just highlighting that if they do need to continue, there will be some budget, needs to be budget set aside. But as we'll come on to later, the scope for more budget is somewhat limited. So just sort of a warning there. And then we move on to the next page, 181, around funding from government. And that's both direct funding from government and the rules government put in place around how we do our funding. Now, I'm not going to comment what we would choose to put our council tax up by if we were not constrained by government, but we are, and expecting that constraint to still be at 1.99% or £5 the Band D property equivalent. And therefore, that it's very clear that as council tax makes a big proportion of our funding, roughly around sort of 70% in terms of our kind of core funding streams, ignoring salaries and charges, that is a big tranche of our funding that is not tracking inflation, and therefore that is adding to our pressures. There's also uncertainty around the amount of money we'll get from governments, less so in the shorter term, but certainly in the medium term, there is still the prospect of a new funding formula at some point. I'm currently assuming 25-26. On the basis we've had a comment from government, we're looking at a 2-year settlement for local government, and there certainly won't be a new funding formula in place for next year. So on that basis, given in the past we've been told that the impact of a new funding formula could be a cut of our funding of in excess of £1 million, we have to look at that as an assumption and model on that basis, and then just hope it's not quite that bad when it comes to fruition. Which brings us to the conclusion, I guess, which is at page 183, and what that looks like in terms of our future funding and our future plans for how we deliver that. As I've said a number of times, we have got quite healthy levels of general fund reserve, and I think the plan should be to use that to some extent to mitigate the early impacts, and therefore try and reduce levels of savings you have to live in the early years of the plan. That's on the basis that if we are in a place we have to cut services, they will need to be services that are discretionary services, and they will therefore be the ones that are more likely to benefit our residents, which they may particularly need during a time of financial pressure and a cost of living crisis. So on that basis, trying to push back the savings needs to make as late as possible, but facing a very real prospect. If we do want to balance our budget in 5 years, we have to budget our balance in the medium term. So that is a requirement. There will be a need on those current forecasts, delivering substantial savings of looking in the order of £2.6 million currently in that time horizon. And I guess it's worth reflecting that over the last 10 years plus, we have delivered, if our services were costing the same as they were back sort of 11, 12 years ago, we probably saved about £11 million or more against our services in that time. And therefore scope for efficiencies where we just trim at the edges are gone. We are looking at, redesigning how we do things, income generation, and potentially to some degree some service cuts to be able to sort of deliver that level of savings. But I guess we are looking at sort of trying to keep going as much as we can before we have to get to that stage, both to get more funding certainty, hopefully our residents in a better place to be able to deal with any kind of changes to our services, and also time just to plan what those will look like and do some public consultation on the back of all of that. But still note we do deliver savings next year, and so therefore the scope for cost increases, investments in new service areas is very, very limited to the extent it's almost zero. And if you are looking at, as when we come through the budget process for February, if we are looking at investing more money in things, we need to find that and then more savings to offset that increase, as well as the savings identified here. Whilst this mainly focuses on the revenue budgets, it's worth mentioning, and it covers it in page 184, that capital budgets are a key component of our budgets as well, and they do have revenue impact. At the moment, we manage to fund all our capital program from capital receipts, but we do therefore have a cost of that. In that, it's less money we've got sitting in our kind of investments, and therefore we're going to lose the interest on that money as we spend it. But also when we get to the point at which we've run out of capital receipts, which will happen in this sort of time horizon, we flip from having that to having to charge a minimum revenue provision, which is the amount of money we have to charge the revenue account each year to reflect we're in a borrowing position. And also in the longer term beyond that, at some point we have to start funding money from actual external borrowing, and that comes at an interest cost. Whereas this time last year, that was sitting at 2.5% for long-term borrowing. It's now hedging above 4% if you look at the latest rates, and continue to go upwards. So I'm looking at how we deal with that and trying to push out that point which we have to borrow externally as late as possible, in the expectation that the interest rates start to come down again, which will make things a lot more affordable. So that's kind of hopefully a fairly detailed introduction to the report, but as ever there is more detail in there, and happy to take any questions on any of that.
Thank you, Ian. Councillor Home.
Yeah, no surprise. There's quite a few, but I'm only going to ask perhaps just one. No mention in there at all about refugees and the impact that'll have on our budget. We know it's had some impact recently, but going out in the forecasts, have we got anything in there for what we may want to do and may have to do around refugees?
That's a good point. And no, there isn't anything currently in there. I think probably something we've got to consider as we go through the budget process into February is around what those costs will be. There is always an emerging impact on our housing team around where we are having some placement breakdowns from those that came in under the Homes for Ukraine scheme, and obviously all the other refugee schemes that are out there as well. So I think that is a fair point, that we will have to keep a watching eye on that, around the impact of that on particularly on the kind of things like our bed and breakfast spend and our hotel spend going forward. I think it's another risk that probably should be flagged in there.
I'm glad that glad we mentioned it, and therefore the appropriate officers and portfolio holders can take cognizance of that as we go forward. One other point I see there on Annex 1, we said the council will not subsidise areas which are responsible other precepting bodies, but then earlier on we said we give 30 grand to parish councils, don't we? Is that not subsidising something done by other authorities?
It's slightly different to that. That's a historic thing in relation to the council tax deduction scheme that's first introduced. So it was to offset the impact they had when that was introduced. So yes, it's not directly subsidising a service they're required to provide. It's providing funding that was taken away from them way back when, albeit when we do have a new funding formula, and if that does lead to significant reductions in our funding, we will look to withdraw that support to parishes at that time, because that was always the commitment, is that as our funding reduced, their funding would also. It just reflects that it's been so long coming, this new funding formula. It's been promised for so many years now. It's never quite made it, but I think at that point it's a fair time to review that amount of money we're going to parish councils. But it's not, that's more stopping other of our preceptors stopping service and expecting us to pick up the bill. It's slightly different to that, and it's more of a historic arrangement.
Well, I could argue it's funding the services they provide, isn't it? Yes, it is funding. So that's what they're using the money for. I don't think they're spending on those non-essential services, hopefully. So I'd like to think those two match in the report. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Yes, very good points. Looks pretty great, isn't it, in the future? Let's hope this new funding formula is going to be a saviour, and inflation is not going to go too out of the wild. I have another question from John Cannon.
Two, please. Churchgate again. A note that the report says it's for financial planning purposes, it's going to be cost neutral. Can you give us some comfort that there's enough liquidity, access to funds to actually service the redevelopment that you would want to do, regardless of ultimate neutral cost? And the other thing, just looking at your projections for the years 2026, 2027 onwards, that sort of saving scale would involve a bit of lead time. So are we joining the dots between the timing of those savings and actually setting the wheels in motion to make those savings in time?
So I'll take the second one first. Yes, I think we are. I think the place we will be is that at some point during next financial year, we will get notified by government of what our future funding will look like. I think that is the timing of a new funding formula. That will at the same time give some degree of lead-in time to when that's implemented. And that will then allow us to start the process in terms of, we've done in the past, you might be aware because you weren't around, we've done some sort of significant work with our service managers and service directors around looking at the spend of the council and where we could make savings if we had to. So following that, we will reinvigorate that work and bring that back out again. And then that will lead through to the exploration of public consultation around looking at areas our residents value and looking at how they sort of think we can make savings, and then try and bring all that together into a plan around what that looks like, which then gives enough time, I think, to deliver those savings with the leading times that some of those will require. You know, some things you can stop, stroke, change quite quickly, and some will take a long time to do. So I think we have got a place there. We do also in the background still have our enterprise team now, it's a new name, which will still look at commercial opportunities, and they're doing that before that anyway. And our transformation work still continues around looking at our processes, and particularly around AI and automation, and how we can use that to essentially manage the level of staffing, take away those admin tasks, and replace them with just information coming in and just going where it needs to get to, rather than being keyed in 3 or 4 times. In terms of your other question around Churchgate, current forecasts are that we would expect in the early years of owning the property, we would actually have a income surplus on the basis that we've funded the capital from capital receipts, and we will now get all of the income from the shopping centre rather than just the head lease income. So that will go up slightly. And actually, as it stands, the current, keeping the centre going as it is has some costs associated with it, some minor works to it, but they're not currently forecast to be significant or excessive. But that will only last for so long, and at some point it's necessary we do have to redevelop that centre, because otherwise it will come with significant costs around, that building is not going to last forever. So therefore, I think the longer term is that we will borrow money, and we can always borrow as a council, we can always borrow money from government, as long as we do it prudently. And I think this is a project we are committed to, and we can do it prudently. So we'll have the capital receipts there to be able to do that, and then our project plan. And I think we will use some of that surplus money to help sort of seed that investment into that area. So whilst there's no detailed plan there yet, I have confidence we can come up with a plan that will work for that area and work for the finances. But I think it was worth highlighting in the report as a risk there. But I think there is a risk that we can get control of.
Okay, does that answer your question, John?
Thank you, it does.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Very good, John. Right. Is there any other questions on this subject? Medium-term strategy, financial strategy? No, nobody else. Okay, then we need to just look at. We're going to be noting this. We're getting this report presented to us before it goes to cabinet. Is that tomorrow? When's the cabinet? Next week. Cabinet next week. Right. The recs are recommendations are note and comment the medium-term financial strategy, and recommend to full council the adoption of the medium-term financial strategy 23 to 28. Okay, we're duly noting it. We don't need to vote. So I'll move on to item 14, which is the last item, you'll be pleased to hear. And this is possible agenda items for future meetings. So this is an open forum discussion about what you'd like us to all address. I think we've already had one with the anti-fraud is going to be coming in to talk to us about how that works. I was thinking myself, I was just thinking it'd be great to have a case study of how the internal audit service works on one particular case study. If got any support for that, that would be, I think that would be great. But is there any other ideas of how what agenda items we should have for future meetings? You can press your thingies. Claire.
I just wondered whether it was worth, or whether it's a bit early to have some sort of discussion or report from officers on the financial implications of Churchgate, both income and expenditure, major and minor. I mean, obviously there's the day-to-day running cost, but there's also the overall redevelopment costs.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Ian.
I think we are looking a bit too early on that. So there will be reports to council in, I think it's going November, around next steps around Churchgate. And I think that will still be quite high level on the basis we're still in the process of taking a project board. So we haven't even got any kind of, we've got ideas from previous work that's been done on Churchgate. We've not got a sort of set project plan yet. So therefore, trying to attach costs to it at this stage in terms of longer term would just be finger in the air, and I think too much to sort of put a report together on. But it will sort of set out next steps. I think there'll be a number of reports over the next probably 2 years around with financial detail on them. But I think trying to do anything too early would just be a case of putting numbers in a report that would never bear fruit as to what will happen in reality. So I think there's a place for this committee to be looking at those reports when they come about. But I think trying to do something too early probably isn't the right way of going.
But maybe something for the future, though. Yes, yeah, Councillor Hone.
Yeah, probably a petty one, but could we have something around the success or otherwise of the lottery?
Yes. Yeah.
I think it should be relatively short and sweet, but certainly give us some idea of what progress is being made and how much is being spent and how much is being gained and how much we're giving to the appropriate causes.
Yes, I think it's a great idea. Ian?
Very happy to pick that up through, I think, the quarterly revenue monitoring reports. Certainly in Q2, we can sort of start to put what the financial impact is. And I think where we've got those sort of stats around supporting that, we can probably put some stats around your ticket sales and that kind of thing to give some sort of background to that as well. So yeah, have to pick up for the revenue monitoring reports on a regular basis.
I think, Chairman, it won't be significant in terms of money terms, and we note, but certainly the concept of it and how it is working, if it is working, and if it's not, what we can do to make it better.
All right, so the whole process itself, as well as the numbers that are coming in.
I'll leave it in their capable hands.
Yeah, but yes, we'll look at that. Ian, sorry.
Just my usual comment, I guess, just making sure we don't cross over into review and scrutiny's role. Yeah, if we're looking at the sort of policy side of it and has the thing worked, that's over in scrutiny. If we look at the financial impact, that's here. So I think just I'll sort of feed that back into the system and sort of make sure we get the reports going in the right place. But yes, overall, we need to make sure we report back on how it's going, but make sure we go to the right place.
Well, of course, be mainly financial how it's going. So that's why I'm suggesting it comes to FAR. I didn't suggest it last night for overview and scrutiny.
Fair enough. Yeah. Any other suggestions of future, immediate future or medium future or future items for the agenda that you'd like to address? Is there any more? Is there more training or anything like that, for instance? Although Ian's already said that we're arranging some stuff hopefully before our next meeting for the fraud. But I'd like to see personally, I'd like to see something on the internal audit process, maybe a case study or something like that. Just doesn't have to be a true one, but how it actually works on the ground. I'd be interested, but I don't know if I've got support for that. if we have, but there must be lots of other things that would come to mind. No, not at the moment. Okay, well maybe this is a reoccurring agenda item. Yeah. Okay. Well, in that case, if there is no other comments. Oh, sorry. So I see you there. Sorry, Ian's going to.
Yeah, on that topic, yeah, obviously you've got a plan now for the next meeting in December. You'll have another meeting in January. So if there is an area of topic you want to sort of start to arrange in terms of a training session before the meeting in January, very happy to do so. I have to talk to Chris around doing something on internal audit. If that's got a vote from the chair, anyone else seems to be nodding. So yeah, I'll try. I'll put that in place. I'll try and check Chris arrange for January then before that meeting to do a quick training session then around sort of, yeah, as you say, we can look at a kind of how an internal audit actually works to sort of give you a bit of kind of background of what happens on the ground.
Fabulous. Thank you. That's great. Well, then in that case, I close this meeting at 21:25. Thank you very much for your attendance and for our remote users, if they're still there.